Hey there everyone, welcome back to another video, and despite my gushings about how good some of Tom Baker's stories as the Fourth Doctor could be, there of course will be some that go amiss. And look, Tom Baker I think was an amazing Doctor. He has some of my favourite Doctor Who episodes of all time, and because of that he lasted 7 years having loads of episodes and stories and quality. But because he lasted so long, in addition to having a load of quality, there were quite a few misfires as well. And that's what this video is going to do. Today we are counting down the 5 worst Fourth Doctor stories. This will be based only on his televised run. And I would like to say before we get started, this is just my opinion obviously, don't get too upset by the choices you see in this video. If you like one of the ones in here, that's okay. So anyway, on to a few honourable mentions, or rather dishonourable mentions, if you will. First up, we've got Power of the Kroll, Revenge of the Cybermen, and lastly, The Invisible Enemy. And now, let's get on to this video. So first up on the list we have The Invasion of Time. Now the reason I dislike The Invasion of Time is mostly just because of the context of the whole thing. Now this was the finale to season 15. It was a 6-parter that saw the Sontarans invading Gallifrey. And what did we get? Sterile and slow direction from start to finish, pretty much. To be honest, I think the best way I could describe season 15 is as sterile. It came off one of my favourite seasons of Doctor Who ever in season 14, and the whole thing just really disappointed me, and in particular this finale, I think, sealed it. For starters, the Doctor is acting way out of character in this story. He does some things that are never explained until the very end, and even then there are some very questionable reasons why he does some of the things that he does. I think that all the side characters are really boring. I think they give characters like Leela and K9 barely anything to do, in favour of the Doctor just kind of acting weird for some reason. I'm not really sure. Just as a whole, it was so underwhelming to watch. For the story about the invasion of Gallifrey, in reality, it's actually just 4 parts of really cheap corridors and tinfoil villains and characters talking about things over and over again. Leela gets banished to the outside of Gallifrey and there's barely any time dedicated to it. This is just such a boring story that feels ridiculously cheap. The Sontarans finally show up 2 parts in and none of them are distinguishable whatsoever. It's a real letdown. Which is a shame, because Gallifrey is meant to be this huge, amazing planet, and so seeing its invasion should be a big deal, but it isn't. It's basically just a backdoor pilot to the next season, except from it's all just so slow, so drawn out, so cheap looking. And the worst thing is, whilst there are some stakes here, don't get me wrong, there are some things that I really like in this story. There's some great acting in my opinion, it comes together okay, and I will agree there is some stakes, but it's just too lifeless of a story for me to feel invested. And don't even get me started on how they handled Leela's exit. Real story, the reason Leela exited so abruptly is because Graham Williams, the producer, thought he could convince Louise Jameson to stay. He then realised about a week before the episode was filming that she was actually still going to leave, so he had to write in about a week a way of getting her to leave, and it is terrible. So that's my ultimate thoughts on this story. It's cheap, it's slow, it's really underwhelming, Leela's exit's horrible, and whilst it does have some redeeming qualities, they're mostly just small glimmers in an otherwise incredibly disappointing story. At number 4 we've got the Horns of Neyman, and if I could use one phrase to describe it, it would be hilariously dumb. It's very, very, very forgettable in the long run. In fact, I kind of actually forgot that this story existed when I came to writing this up, and then I remembered, oh yeah, the Horns of Neyman existed, and I felt like I had to give it a mention. Why? Well, it's really badly directed. It suffers through a lot of problems that Season 17 had, which is some really bad production design. There's some really bad acting in this, some really cheesy moments here that just don't work. And don't get me wrong, there are several so bad that it's good moments, in particular some of the performances here. The Romana stuff is okay in the story, it's not too boring, and like I said, this can be really funny sometimes, unintentionally, but it's kind of just a waste of potential. It's got the framework of a good plot, but the execution is just so awful. There's nothing about this story that particularly sticks out to me other than how hilariously dumb it can be sometimes. And for that reason, I think it had to be in this position. Light-hearted, goofy premise? Check. Bright colours and returning actors from the previous seasons? Check. A Season 18 story? Check. Great, we have got the formula for a guilty pleasure Doctor Who story. Meg Loss. I kinda like Meg Loss, but also I hate it. It's got a very dumb and ridiculous plot, to the point where I don't actually take any of this story seriously. I just think it's so funny. We're at a point where Tom Baker, he still doesn't care, but he also does, to the point where, in terms of irony, it is still really funny. It's just a really generic plot, basically. It's overly bombastic. The directing is equally as overly bombastic in this case, but the rest of it feels rather mute, to be honest. There's some bad acting, a pretty dumb story, some ridiculous production design that looks crazily cheap, but above all else, it's kind of just lifeless. And I love it for that reason. This is a really funny story. Not intentionally. I don't know. If you like dumb 80s sci-fi episodes, then by far Meg Loss is the story for you. But if you're not into this sort of thing, then you're probably not gonna like it. A couple of other notes, the music's good here. I do like how this story did try to put some colour in, although I think they overstepped the mark there. And I would never say I was ever bored in this one. But come on now, Meg Loss, you're just a bit stupid, really. Boring! Good god, where to begin with Underworld. I suppose I can start off with how ridiculously overambitious the story is. And don't get me wrong, I've accused a lot of Doctor Who stories, particularly ones I dislike, of being overambitious in the past. But I think of all episodes of Doctor Who, this one is probably going to have to take the cake for the most overly ambitious one. Why? Well, I mean, you can see the screen right now. The effects in this one are just dreadful. They're trying to do so much in terms of special effects, in terms of plot, in terms of all of these science fiction elements, and they just mesh terribly. None of it pays off. The blue screen is horrendous in this, all the compositing sucks, a lot of the art design is really, really bad in this one. But above all else, it's just so badly paced. A couple of additional notes, I think it's really badly directed, and you can just see from all the choreography and a lot of the really bad acting that goes on in this episode. I couldn't take anything from this story seriously. And the plot itself, I actually kind of have no idea. There are some weird things called the Minions that are ridiculously boring. The villains I can't even remember. There's a lot of walking through blue screen tunnels that just look so bad. This episode came out the same year as Star Wars, and this episode has aged so much worse than Star Wars did. It was clearly trying to emulate that throughout the plot. Tom Baker didn't care, Louise Jameson didn't care, and I don't really blame them. When you're still in a green screen background, asked to deliver a load of nonsense, of course you're not gonna care. The whole story is just so dull and senseless, and it just flops horribly at everything it's trying to do. It's completely meaningless and vapid in terms of what it has to offer. There's some really bad production design in this one, and ultimately I could just say that this episode is trying too hard. It's so boring, and none of its effects land to the point where it is just a massive waste of time. The Leisure Hive. Now, Season 18 disappointed me, and that disappointment started with the premiere story, The Leisure Hive. The Leisure Hive, to put things simply, makes no sense at all. It's based on this science of tachyonics, and to be honest, a lot of the science they have in here is just made up and ridiculous. They're using long words and confusing concepts and vague, broad sentences to try and explain a plot to us that's trying to be clever, but it's also ridiculously simple. I don't know how they managed to make the most convoluted plot into also the most stupid as well. The cliffhangers felt ridiculously cheap. It literally felt like John Nathan Turner was coming through the screen and asking me to watch the next episode. A lot of the plotting is just really dull, so are all the characters in this, and that's probably the biggest problem that this has, which is Tom Baker could not care less. Now, I've said a few times that he doesn't care about the script in a couple of my criticisms for some of these stories, but this one is his absolute worst performance out of all of them. There's no charm, there's no glee at being the Doctor that shines through. He is just miserable and fed up, which is probably why this was his last season. There's some really bad pace in here, there's some awful acting, some bad dialogue. K9 is, once again, really annoying. And I think it's just yet another victim of what happened to Doctor Who in the 1980s. The direction is overly bombastic, poorly edited, and it's just trying to do too much at once. It's trying to mix the old morals and style of the show with a complete new one, and a load of science and all of these other elements that they've thrown at the wall, and none of them have stuck, to the point where it's basically made the wall collapse. There's no redeeming qualities about the Leisure Hive. It's ridiculously boring and stupid, and above all else, it's the story that made Tom Baker leave. Therefore, I think it has absolutely earned its place as the worst Fourth Doctor story. But before you go now, I do have one major question left for you. Since I have now finished talking about the Fourth Doctor, I want you to know who else you'd want me to do a top 5 best and worst stories of. Would you like me to do it on the 10th Doctor, David Tennant, or the 11th Doctor, Matt Smith? Let me know down in the comments, and as always, I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.